We good to go?
Yes.
Hey. Okay, good. Hey, John. Hello, everybody. And we have another Houstonian here, so that's good. Okay, good. I'm glad everybody can hear me fine. Well, welcome to the course. I'm glad everyone could make it. We have a nice turnout, and it should be a lot of fun. Let me just ask, who here, just type up in the chat session if you know how to use it and if you feel like it. Who here is not, who here is taking a Mises Academy course for the first time? Okay. What about second time, or people who've taken it multiple times? I know I've seen a couple of return faces here. Yeah, John, you were in the last course, although I think you audited a lot. Okay. Okay, good. Good. Well, I'm glad you guys came back. This should be fun. Many of you may know I'm a big Hoppian, and what I will do in this course is give my opinions, but try to explain when it's my opinion and when I think it's a more objective kind of received understanding. But let's go ahead and get started. If everyone can see the slides, I'm going to go to slide 2 now. And just a brief introduction about me for people who haven't had a course with me before. I'm an attorney in Houston. I'm a libertarian writer, and I edit a journal called Libertarian Papers. And I've been involved with libertarian theory for like 25 years now, and the Mises Institute for almost that long. I was originally heavily influenced by Ayn Rand and in law school, and then I worked at large law firms for several years, and now I'm a general counsel for a small company. Oh, Dante is another return. I met Dante twice. I met Dante, I met you in Bodrum, Turkey, and in New York, so that's great. Maybe Danny can help you figure out what to adjust. Okay, I'm going to slide 3 now. Maybe I have 2 slide 2s and 3s. And so my background or my influences would be, I would say, is Rothbard and Hoppe and Mises. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm a heavily Austrian influenced anarchist attorney and libertarian. So Rothbard, Mises, and Hoppe are where I'm coming from. Now, let me just go over a quick overview of the course. We have almost 50 students last time I checked. John, do I still value Rand's philosophy? Yeah, sure. I value a lot of it, although I'm increasingly skeptical over the years of many of her concrete applications of her own basic philosophy. I did talk a lot about this in my last course on libertarian legal theory. I think she misstepped on her value theory and, of course, on minarchism and on intellectual property. Okay. So, anyway, in this course, but actually I think there's a lot of overlap between Austro-anarchist, Rothbardian, Hoppian ideas, and even Misesian ideas, and objectivist ideas, although they use a different language sometimes, a different conceptual terminology. I might actually go into that in this course. I have a chart I've developed that kind of shows the parallels. But in any case, so we have around 50 students from 8 different countries, which is a nice, diverse group here. I hope the timing is not too bad for a lot of you. I know that it's late in the morning for Jock Coates over there in Oxford. So we're going to have 6 lectures covering a variety of different aspects of Hoppe's thought. I will veer from it a little bit to touch on related areas, but mostly it'll be about Hoppe's thought himself. And today, oh, there's a typo, it says day. Today we're going to talk about property foundations, because these inform both his cultural and political and economic views. So I'm going to slide 6 now. So as for the course, for people who haven't had a course before, you're free to email me anytime at my email address, which is on this page. It might be better to use the course forum if you want other people to get the benefit of answers and have discussion. I don't think the whiteboard is activated, but if it is, please don't interfere with it here. In previous courses, I had office hours scheduled regularly. I don't think it's necessary in every course. 2 of the courses I did not do it. I'd be happy to have extra office hours if we need to or if people request it. And I've mentioned in the introductory sort of article for the course that Professor Hoppe, we tried to get him to actually be a guest video speaker live, but the time zone difference is too bad because he lives in Turkey, and at 6 o'clock at night here is, I don't know, 4 in the morning there, something like that. So we couldn't arrange it. What he could send it to is if the students develop written questions and send them to me, I'll collect them together, send them to Professor Hoppe, and he can provide some answers to any questions that we can't, get developed satisfactorily here. We'll probably do that in the 5th or 6th lecture to have time to develop the course. So feel free to send me questions for Professor Hoppe if we can't address them to your satisfaction here. So the way the course works, we will have 2 tests. You're not obligated to take them. Don't feel pressured at all. If you'd like to, it's fine. It'll be fun and not too hard, but it will test your knowledge of the material we cover in the course. It'll be multiple choice. We'll have a midterm and a final, and we'll have them weighted a certain way. Now, the way the course works, if you take the test, both tests, you get a certificate of completion. If you don't take them, then you're eligible to get a certificate of participation if you like. And the test, and I'll review this before the test, after the 3rd lecture and after the 5th lecture, or the 6th lecture. They'll be based upon everything I actually discuss in the lectures, everything in these slides, which sometimes have hyperlinks, and the suggested reading material, which I list on the course page. If there's optional reading material, I won't test on that. Okay? Okay, so slide 8, that's an example of what the certificate of completion looks like from the last course I taught. Okay? By the way, are there any questions about it? What I intend to do today is I will lecture for about an hour to around 7 p.m. Central Time, which is my time, to about an hour from now. Take a quick break, and then we'll do Q&A if there's any Q&A or further lecturing. If I go over or don't cover everything in these slides today, I'll just continue next time and adjust the lectures accordingly. So any questions so far about logistics or the course itself? And we have over half the course here. That's pretty good. Okay, good. Slide 9. Oh, so the primary readings for this course are the 2 books that are 2 of my biggest influences by Hoppe, and they're both online for free. His primary treatise, which is A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, TSC, and The Economics and Ethics of Private Property, which collects a lot of his more important essays. They're both free online. By the way, so this is just a quick background about my influence on Hoppe. And so today's lecture, by the way, is chapters 1 and primarily chapter 2 of TSC, which will go into a lot of the concepts in there today. I was in law school in 1988 to 91, and I actually started reading Hoppe in around 88. So I've been studying him closely for about 23 years. I've been a friend and associate of his since about 94. So maybe say 16, 17, maybe 18 years now. And I've read all this stuff. This is the old copy of his TSC. You can see it was actually a bad copy. I mean, the ink is falling off. But it's my dog-eared copy, and I've got almost every page has underlining and notes. And anyway, the new version is much nicer actually, but I keep this because I've got my notes in it. This is my 1993 and 94 copy of his EEPP, which now has a new edition out. So here's Professor Hoppe's Democracy book, which some of you may have, which I will not cover this book in the class because it's not online. Instead, on the immigration stuff, I'll cover online articles which are available. This is one of his fantastic works. This is his Economic Science and Austrian Method book, which is a monograph some notes I have here. Anyway, it's available online as well, and a lot of other works I have by Professor Hoppe. These are the old paper ones I got in the early 90s or whatever. So that's just where I'm coming from. So we're going to study Professor Hoppe in this course, so let me just go a quick biographical historical background. So Professor Hoppe was born in Germany in 1949, and he studied history, sociology, and philosophy in Frankfurt in the 60s and 70s. His doctoral dissertation dealt with the praxeological foundations of epistemology. I don't think he called it praxeology at the time because he had not yet been exposed to Austrian economics. But his central thesis was very Austrian. It was that all cognitive processes, and thus all sciences, are but special forms of human action. And so he believed that it followed that the laws of action were also the basic laws of epistemology. If this doesn't make a lot of sense to you now, don't worry about it. We'll go into it later in more detail. I'm just kind of giving an overview now, who he is and where he's coming from. Then he discovered the writing of Mises and then Rothbard, and this opened his eyes, and he became a devout Austrian economist. He continued his philosophical studies, and he developed a bunch of new epistemological and methodological insights based on Misesian and Rothbardian insights. So you can think of it this way: Mises influenced Rothbard, who influenced Hoppe. He was influenced by both. Those are my poodles barking. They'll stop soon. I apologize for that. So in the 80s, Hoppe went to the U.S. On a Heisenberg Fellowship, and he studied political philosophy and kept building his knowledge of Austrian economics. Finally, he befriended Rothbard and became his sort of closest protege and friend, and became a colleague of his at UNLV, where they both taught together for many years. Now, Rothbard died in '95. At that point, Hoppe became the editor of the Journal of Libertarian Studies, which recently ceased publishing, and he was the co-editor of the Review of Austrian Economics, and then after that turned into the QJAE, the quarterly journal. He was a co-editor of that. So he's been heavily involved in the libertarian and Austrian movement for a couple of decades. Currently, Hoppe lives in Bodrum, Turkey, and he founded about 6 years ago the Property and Freedom Society, of which I'm a member as well. It has annual meetings in Turkey since 2006. So the reason it's in Turkey is his wife lives in Turkey and has a nice resort in Bodrum, Turkey, and that's a convenient place for the annual meetings. So this is all sort of non-substantive background. Now, as for Hoppe's influences intellectually, obviously it's Mises and Rothbard, but his PhD dissertation advisor was a world-famous philosopher named Jürgen Habermas, who is a extremely interesting and intelligent and prolific and famous philosopher in Germany, socialist on politics, or left, soft socialist like most European thinkers and liberals are. But he was influenced heavily by his methodology, especially his argumentation ethics, and also the work on argumentation ethics by German philosopher Karl Otto Appel. He's also heavily influenced by Kant, as we'll see, not the evil Kant of Randian sort of distortion, but a reasonable version of Kant. So but the main influences will be Habermas and especially Mises and especially Rothbard. So just go into that a little bit. In terms of Habermas and Appel, they have this theory called argumentation ethics, which is an argument that the nature of human discourse can be used to establish certain normative or ethical truths, like the value of democracy. I'm talking about Habermas and Appel, not Hoppe, or certain freedoms and rights, things like this. Now, if you ever try to read a Habermas book, which I have, and it's a little bit, grab one here. This is one of the few English ones, Moral Consciousness and Communicative Action. It is, it's wild stuff, and it's interesting, but it's very obscure and dense, and I don't think it's very rigorous and not very libertarian, and the stuff that's and it is not all relevant to political theory or our political theory anyway. But Hoppe extracted from it this core argumentation ethics or the discourse ethics idea, which we'll talk about in maybe 3 or 4 lectures. But unlike them, unlike Appel and Habermas, who used argumentation ethics or discourse ethics to result in sort of soft socialist conclusions, like a right to welfare, right to a job, basically the UN Charter type stuff, Hoppe combined it with the things he had learned from Mises and Rothbard to make it into a libertarian argument, to come to libertarian conclusions. And I think it's a powerful argument. It's been very controversial in libertarian circles, and we'll go into that as well. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Rand, you will have heard Kant demonized over and over again. Hoppe is not a big advocate of Kant. Neither was Mises. They both basically took some of his ideas and terminology, and they use it in a very reasonable, rational way, and in a realistic way. Mises was a realist. He was not an idealist. He was not a subjectivist in the sense that Randians criticize. When Rand criticizes people for being subjectivist, she was criticizing what we would probably call a relativist. People who think there are no objective values, no objective proof, we can't really know anything for sure, which is not the view of Hoppe and Mises, or even the view of Kant, according to some interpretations. Basically, you can think of Kant as having a American and a European interpretation. The American interpretation is the one Rand criticized. It was more idealist. And of course, I would blame Kant himself for being obscure in writing and lending support to these interpretations, and who knows what he really meant. But there are basically 2 ways to look at what Kant wrote. So one is the idealist view, that we can never know the real world. We have duty ethics. We have to live for duty rather than for ourselves or for our personal interests. Excuse me. I have to sneeze in a second. Sorry. So, excuse me. And there is a more European or continental tradition that interprets Kant in a more realist way. And I have a post here if anyone is interested. I won't test on this. But Barry Smith, who's another Austrian-type philosopher, Austrian-influenced philosopher, has written on this. I have a quote from him. There are several books and studies and opinions that there is a realist version of Kant, which Rand would not really have objected to if she had interpreted him that way. In any case, it's more the Kantian terminology and framework that Hoppe uses, but in a realist way, as buttressed by the Misesian realist insights. And again, I'm not really going into an in-depth lecture on this today. I'm just setting the ground. We will have a full lecture on the epistemology and the methodology stuff. Okay, so let's go to slide 14. So Hoppe was strongly Misesian, and he is one of the most praxeological writers you will read. A lot of Austrian economists appreciate it, but their writing is sort of on applications or other fields. It's compatible with praxeology, but they don't really apply it and swim it and extend it like Hoppe does. There are a few that do this, Joe Salerno, Hans Hoppe, Jeff Herbener, Guido Hülsmann, Walter Block, but there are other Austrians who don't really apply, but Hoppe is one of the strongest pure praxeological writers out there. So he is strongly Misesian in that sense. Politically, he's more radical than Mises. Mises was more of a minarchist or a classical liberal, although I have a blog post that shows he was arguably an anarchist. I mean, he was really close. He was a lot closer to anarchism than, say, Ayn Rand or other classical liberals, like, say, Milton Friedman. He was really close to being an anarchist, very radical thinker for his time. He was, like I said before, he's an epistemological realist, like Mises. Now, what he did was, his argumentation ethics, he views that as sort of an extension of praxeology or praxeological type reasoning to ethics. For those who aren't familiar with praxeology, I will go to it a little bit later today and in other lectures, but praxeology is the Misesian view of how we understand economics, which they viewed as the science or the logic of human action. So it was almost an a priori science as opposed to posteriori or empirical science. A priori meaning we have certain basic core truths that we know to be true for sure, or what they say apodictically. We can know them to be true in the same way that Aristotle, for example, and by the way, this example coming up demonstrates how a lot of these ostensible differences between, say, the Kantian framework and the Aristotelian or classical framework or the natural law framework are really only cosmetic or terminological. Because Aristotle, of course, demonstrated a lot of fundamental truths, what Ayn Rand would call axioms, right? By showing that to deny this would involve a contradiction. So, for example, the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, the law of causality. You can take these things to be true apodictically, because to deny it would lead to contradiction. Even Descartes had this with his cogito ergo sum, right? His I think, therefore I am, which on the surface seems like you're saying, because I think I am, but he wasn't saying that. What he was saying was, because I know that I think, therefore I know that I am. In other words, even if you're a total skeptic and you don't know anything about the world and you think you might be a brain in a vat, or you might be being subject to an illusion or having a hallucination or a dream, you know that you are thinking. To deny that is self-contradictory. And to be thinking, you must be something that exists that is thinking. So all this kind of logic is very traditional and historical based. Now, so the Kantians call it a priori, and what they meant by that was it's before the senses. But they didn't mean that you could be born from the womb and then know this stuff. They didn't even mean that it was intuitive. What they meant was that you can know or you can demonstrate that it's true without having to do an experiment. Or to put it another way, you can know that something is true and you can not bother to test it because you know that it's impossible to disprove it. An example would be the law of supply and demand in economics. Some of the more positivist or the empiricist-minded economists like Milton Friedman would say that we postulate or hypothesize a law, like the law of supply and demand, and then we go test it. We get data points and we see if it fits the curve or whatever. But the reason they do that is because, let me take a little detour here. The essential method, the epistemological or methodological method of the Misesian Austrians, including Rothbard and Hoppe, although Rothbard used an Aristotelian terminology, is what we call dualism. By dualism, what they mean is there are two realms of reality, or two realms of understanding. One realm is the realm of the natural laws, the causal laws, natural sciences like physics and chemistry. Those are to be understood and studied in accordance with the scientific method. That is, the Popperian idea that you hypothesize a law, a causal law, like the law of gravity, and then you test it and you see if you can verify it or falsify it. This is the scientific method. Although, as Hoppe shows, and we'll get into this in another lecture, even that method has certain a priori assumptions about the scientific method itself, for example, about methodology, about evidence, about how we interact with the world. But on the other hand, there is the teleological realm. That is the realm of human purpose. So when you study a human's actions, or what he does, and you seek to understand it as a fellow human, and to understand it in terms of his motivations, his goals, his purposes, his means, his desires, then you are thinking teleologically. And to understand that realm requires a different set of operative presuppositions and a different methodology. So, for example, by the nature of human action, we know that when people act, they seek to achieve an end, they use a means to achieve it, and they also have different alternatives that they're available to them that they choose between. So you can see right away that we know just by what human action is that we can know that humans have choice. They have opportunity costs. Those are the choices that you didn't choose. They have ends and means. And that there's causality even, because you couldn't act, that is to choose a means to achieve an end, unless you believed it could causally achieve the ends. So there's an implicit belief, a presupposed belief in causality in the universe. So this is the basic way of looking at it. Action is a viewpoint, said Jock Coates in the comments here, as Murphy put it in his course. I haven't heard that before, but that sounds right to me. I mean, and we'll get into this even later, I think, in the notes today. Mises explicitly says that, you know, from the point of view of God, maybe we don't have free will. Maybe he can predict everything we're doing. But what that means in my mind, and Hoppe writes about this a little bit, is that you can view human beings as either bodies having behavior and influenced by purely causal influences, or as teleological, goal-driven actors having desires and goals. So it's sort of like when you try to diagnose what's wrong with a car that's not running anymore, you think in certain functional macro level, like the carburetor or the fuel injector and the gas tank and the internal combustion engine, the cylinders and the steering wheel and the wheels and the chassis and the drive. You think in these macro terms because they're functional, and that's how we understand this. That's how we made it as humans. Theoretically, you could have a computer look at the car as a swarm of subatomic particles like quarks, trillions or quadrillions or Google trillions or whatever of these particles interacting solely on the basis of the four laws of physics, the law of gravity and electromagnetism and the strong and the weak nuclear forces, and analyze the position of all those particles at a moment in time and their momentum and inertia or whatever, and input it into a supercomputer and crank it out and predict exactly what's going to happen and try to figure out. But if you look at a big swarm of quarks, it's hard to see what the functional problem is, why this car isn't working. It's not a car anymore, it's a swarm of quarks. Anyway, this is my perspective on it. I'm deviating a little bit from Hoppe here. I don't think it's incompatible, but I haven't heard him talk about it like this. But this is, in essence, what we do when we look at other humans as actors instead of as mechanized, basically, meat robots following pure causal laws and behaving instead of acting. It's just a more efficient conceptual way to look at it. But there's two ways to do it. In any case, we do view ourselves as actors, and when we relate to other people, we look at them as actors, or as Hoppe says, as a person, not a corpus. That is, some actor having personhood rather than a body that's just a physical meat body. In any case, so what about Rothbard? Now, Hoppe is a strongly Rothbardian. He probably identifies most closely with Rothbard, although his terminology is more Kantian and closer to that of Mises. He talks in more a priori terms. Rothbard tended to put a Aristotelian conceptual or terminological spin on the same basic Kantian ideas. I mean, Rothbard was an a priorist, and he did use those terms. But he sometimes talks in more natural law language and more the language of Aristotle. There's actually an interesting article, which I'll just throw out there, by Barry Smith about Aristotelian or fallible a priorism. I think it's in an old issue of the JLS, or the Review of Austrian Economics. It's about fallibilistic a priorism. And the idea there, which Hoppe agrees with, is that when we say we know something a priori, we don't mean we're infallible or omniscient. All we mean is it's a different type of knowledge and demonstrated or validated in a different way than empirical knowledge. What we mean is that we can know some things are true by first establishing a basic axiom or a priori proposition or truth by realizing that its denial is self-contradictory. And then reasoning validly and deductively from there. On occasion, as Mises said, we introduce explicitly certain contingent empirical ideas, and then that makes your resulting theory less apodictic because the introduced assumption may be wrong, but it makes it more interesting. So, for example, Rothbard starts out his analysis, and so does Hoppe in some of his social theory, with the Crusoe society, Robinson Crusoe alone on an island, and you just talk about human action in the context in a world of scarcity or whatever, but there's no other humans, there's no society, there's no interaction, there's no economy really, and they analyze it based upon that. And then Mises or Rothbard will say, well, let's assume that there's more than one person. That's an empirical assumption. Let's assume that there's some interaction and exchange and trade, and let's even assume that they've developed money. Now, that's called catalactics in Austrian economics. That's a catalactic economy is one in which there's a more advanced market economy where there's money instead of just barter. Now, there can be economies and societies where there's no barter. There can even be situations where there's no other people, there's just one person, or even no people. But to have an interesting analysis that we can apply to our world, we have to introduce some assumptions. And so those are done that way, and Rothbard does that as well. So Rothbard and Hans are both, Hoppe are both anarchist, Austrian anarchist libertarians, a lot more radical than Mises was. There are actually some differences. Rothbard was more of an American, and a little bit, he had more of what Hans called a soft spot for democracy, and actually so did Mises. They both sort of viewed it as imperfect, but they viewed it as the move in the world in the early 1900s from basically monarchies to more democracies in Europe and America. They viewed that as progress, so as being closer to some kind of libertarian or classical liberal ideal. And that is one view of theirs that Hoppe has actually challenged, as we'll see in one of the lectures in this course, with his strong criticism of democracy. Ayn Rand, of course, had this problem as well, not really democracy so much, but this sort of America worship, or this founders worship, or the Constitution worship, this sort of naive, well, the view of myself and people like Hans Hoppe, that it's a little bit naive for libertarians to just assume that the original American founding was an almost libertarian society, that the Constitution, although imperfect, was close to what we really need. In other words, viewing the original American situation as a template or an almost ideal achievement of a libertarian goal. Rand was very, very much of this view. And there was a little bit of that in Rothbard and Mises, of course. And Hans is more radical and rejects that. And I think his non-American perspective helps him to be a little bit more clear-headed about this. And I think nowadays more libertarians, more radical anarchists and Austrian libertarians are moving more and more in that direction of being a lot more cynical and skeptical of this mythical or naive view that America is really the libertarian country. And Rothbard, of course, had a lot of that skepticism and cynicism with his hostility towards American imperialism and expansionism and aggression, and his comments that, you know, the Soviet Union was a lot less imperialist than the U.S., a lot less aggressive, etc., which, of course, angered a lot of the Randians who have this, they hold on strongly to the idea that America is something that you can love as a liberal, as a classical liberal, or as a libertarian. So that is Hoppe's sort of connection to his influences, primarily Mises and Rothbard, and of course his teachers, his teacher Habermas. Now, his important output were a few books in German, which I won't even try to pronounce because I don't speak German. These are on epistemology, anarchist theory, things like this. And then his most important work, I believe, is A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, first published in '89. And then an important collection of his essays, The Economics and Ethics of Private Property, EEPP, which two more articles were added in 2006. However, there are 3 or 4 important articles of his which are not in either of those books, which we will cover in this class. He also has an important monograph on his epistemology and methodology, which I've already shown you, this one here, Economic Science and the Austrian Method. And also a very influential work of his that came a little bit late after it already became fairly well known in libertarian circles on democracy, Democracy, the God That Failed, and also a collection of essays, The Myth of National Defense. He's the editor of this one, but he's got several good articles in it. He's very well known for our purposes in terms of a fairly esoteric minority political viewpoint intellectual. His work has been published, translated into at least 22 other languages outside of English, or originally published in other languages like German or French. So, given all this background, given his heavy influence in Misesian and Rothbardian ideas, it shouldn't be a surprise that basically his work is grounded strongly and very rigorously and tightly in Austrian property concepts, realistic epistemology, and radical and Rothbardian sort of oriented anti-statist politics and Austrian economics. I also find Hoppe's work to be extremely precise and clear to read, very much like Rothbard's. Maybe even more precise and rigorous than Rothbard's in some respects, but they're both very clear and plain thinkers, and they let you know what they're saying. Unlike a lot of our opponents on the left, and even unlike Mises to some extent, who was quite dense to read, like Human Action is quite a challenge to many people. Although when you get used to it, you can learn a lot from it. Just a quick break. Does anyone have any requests or questions at this point? Because what I intend to do is speak for another 20, 25 minutes on this lecture and then take a quick break. Anyone have any issues or questions at this point? Okay, good. Hear me okay? Sound all right? Video quality okay? Okay, good. Ethan, would you turn the light on in here, the bright light? Just one of those switches. So Hoppe's work, which will cover as much of this as we can in a sort of coherent way, has touched on sociology, economics, philosophy, and epistemology, and of course libertarianism and political theory, and also history as well. I don't think we'll talk too much on the history here. But let me just touch quickly. I mentioned some of this in the introductory article for this course, which I assume most of you have read already. But among his contributions, which we will discuss in this course, would be his critique of positivism, which I've talked about already. When I talked earlier about the dualist perspective of Mises and Rothbard and Hoppe, this is the perspective I'm talking about. In their framework, the scientists like Milton Friedman, who attempt to study laws of economics as if they are causal laws or laws of natural sciences, are making the mistake of monism. Monism meaning one thing. In other words, trying to cram two different disparate fields into the same methodological or investigative framework. There are some synonyms that you'll hear thrown around that describe this kind of approach: historicism or scientism. Scientism meaning an over-worship of the natural sciences. I think basically what happened is the social sciences have been a mess over the last 2 centuries, let's say. Parts of it have been good, but you have Austrian economics developing, but you have other economics as well, and it's been a mess. Philosophy's been confused the last 2 centuries. Sociology, psychology doesn't seem rigorous to a lot of people. And so, meanwhile, we've had a lot of successes in the natural sciences, right? We've had amazing technological developments based upon physics and chemistry and engineering. And so what happens is physics as the model and chemistry, etc., gain the reputation of being true, legitimate, real, hard sciences because you can test it and you get good results. Meanwhile, the social sciences seem to be soft and inconclusive, and everyone's debating, and you have three different people have three different opinions. You don't know how to choose between them. You can't really do a test. So what happened was, at least some of the social sciences started aping or mimicking the methods of the natural sciences. Economics being the primary one. I mean, Milton Friedman is a notorious example of this. He's an explicit positivist. Now, in practice, you'll see that they speak out of both sides of their mouth. So Milton Friedman, Chicagoites, and Coasians, and monetarists will say certain things. Like they'll say, well, we know that if you increase the minimum wage, it will cause unemployment because we've tested it. But they don't really believe it because of tests. They believe it because of reasoning, very similar to what an Austrian would do. And in fact, if they did a test and found that a minimum wage increase caused unemployment to go down or employment to go up, they would think there's an anomaly. They would check their data and they would run the test again. So they really have an a priori approach to things without admitting it. And they don't admit it because they're confused and they don't have a coherent philosophical background because they've given up philosophy. They gave it up because they think it's unscientific. So this is monism. This is one of the chief enemies of, enemies, but intellectual sort of opponents or things that that Austrians criticize. And this will run throughout a lot of the aspects of this course and Hoppe's and Mises' thought. So that's that first bullet point there. Also, as I mentioned earlier, he developed a very unique and radical and groundbreaking, in my view, and important and controversial. I'm okay. I'll eat something you cook it, but otherwise I'm okay. Anyway, view of libertarian rights called Argumentation Ethics, based upon a combination of Misesian and Rothbardian and even Habermasian insights. He also has a fascinating comparative analysis of capitalism and socialism, which we'll start touching on next week. A very provocative and influential criticism of democracy, which we'll touch on in one lecture, along with his views on natural elites and immigration, which has been one of his most controversial views as a libertarian. Also, his work on economic methodology and epistemology, which I've touched on. And then what I'll do is, in some political lectures, I'll talk about some concrete political insights and reasoning of Hoppe. And on the economic side, some of his economics work and articles and groundbreaking insights like monopoly theory and the theory of public goods. Okay? So this is where we are. This is what we're heading towards. I've mentioned already Mises and Rothbard and even Habermas, but what I found interesting was there's a book edited by Randall Holcomb called The Great Austrian Economists, or sometimes called The 15 Great Austrian Economists, and the last chapter is the chapter on Rothbard written by Hoppe. It's the last chapter because Rothbard is sort of the latest in the chain of important Austrian economists covered in that work. And if you're interested to read through this, I see a comment from Jock here. I didn't see when you posted it. Which turned me into an anarchist? What was it, Jock, that turned you into an anarchist? I'm curious what that was because I missed the correlation to what I was saying. Anyway, you can type it if you get a chance. Okay, right, fine. Are you talking about a lecture by Hoppe on the impossibility of limited government? Okay, I didn't remember mentioning it. Sorry. In any case, if you read this essay, which is it's very short. It's a fascinating essay. He does a really good job of putting the contributions of Rothbard and Mises into perspective. And he's a very humble guy, but I mean, he falls right into this. He's sort of building upon all this. But he explains, and I'll just do a little reading here. I won't read all this. You can read it later if you like, and read the article itself. But I have some quotes here. But he explains that Rothbard was sort of the latest at the end of this. Let me take a break here. Rick asked, are many of these arguments considered transcendental in that the opposite view undermines intelligibility or contradict themselves? Yeah, that label is often applied to these type of arguments. I don't really know if it's necessary as a label to explain how these arguments work, but I have heard that label applied. Excuse me, let me close my door here real quick. Okay, back. So Rothbard could be seen as the latest exponent of the rationalist branch of the Austrian school, because there are other Austrians who are not really as rationalist, like the Hayekian branch, or nowadays the Kersnerians, or other. I think like Wieser, von Wieser wasn't quite as much, and there are others early on. But basically, if you go from Karl Menger, the founder, and go to, I'm going to mangle this word, I know, but Eugen von Bauwerk and Ludwig von Mises, these three are the primary rationalists of the school, and Mises sort of perfected and systematized what had been developed before by them. And Rothbard as well was a rationalist and was a critic of social relativism. So you can see this is not the Kantianism that Rand criticized. So including historicism, which is sort of a variant of positivism, logical positivism, I mean, and empiricism and positivism and skepticism. And then as Hoppe writes, there are three things to recognize about Rothbard. And these are important. This is not about Rothbard, this lecture, but Hoppe is so integrated with Rothbard's thought, it's important to be aware of this. So number one, like his predecessors, Rothbard defends the view that economic laws not only exist, but they're exact, as Menger called them, or a prioristic, as Mises called them, laws. And I've already mentioned this already. So basically, it's a type of dualist perspective. Okay, so that is one thing about Rothbard. Number two, he's the latest and most comprehensive system builder in economics, in Austrian economics. And that tendency only really exists among the rationalist strain of Austrians. Okay, so as he says here, while they contributed much to its foundation, neither Menger nor von Bauwerk accomplished this ultimate intellectual desideratum. This feat was accomplished only by Mises with the publication of his monumental Human Action. And as he writes, today, Human Action by Mises and Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State are the two towering and defining achievements of the Austrian school. And I also believe that we need to include Hoppe's work as well, and that of other more modern Austrians as well, like Salerno and Hülsmann. And third, Rothbard is the latest and most systematically political Austrian economist. So just as rationalism implies the desire for system and completeness, it also implies political activism, because we view humans as rational animals, and their actions in the course of human history are determined by ideas. That is, we're not determined. We do have choice, which is another undeniable or a priori assumption when you view people as human actors. That is the perspective that Murphy talked about, apparently, and the teleological side of this dualistic divide. Okay? So this is the part that made me think of Hoppe when I read it. He wrote about Rothbard. Proceeding systematically even beyond Mises, Rothbard accomplished in the Ethics of Liberty an integration using the concept of private property, of value-free Austrian economics and libertarian political philosophy or ethics as two complementary branches of a grand unified social theory, thereby creating a radical Austro-libertarian philosophical movement. And I agree completely with this, and Hoppe is the sort of main representative of that, and the person who's extended and built on that and even firmed it up in some ways. So basically you can think of the lineage as Menger to von Bauwerk to Mises to Rothbard to Hoppe. And of course, this is not to slight the earlier thinkers. As Newton said famously, if I have seen further, it is only by standing on the shoulders of giants. And this is the brilliance of the internet and our modern times, is that we can all learn from these amazing insights that we've accumulated now that can spread instantly and for free from Mises.org and over the internet now. And I wrote a little bit about this in my post, which I have linked here at the bottom of slide 20. And more about Hoppe's contributions. I and Guido Hülsmann organized a festschrift, which is a collection of essays in honor of a distinguished sort of thinker, in 2009, in honor of Hoppe's 60th birthday. Excuse me. Called Property, Freedom, and Society, and the name was modeled after the name of his Property and Freedom Society. And it's got a host of wonderful contributions from thinkers all around the world, and you can see the influence of Hoppe's ideas in that book, and it's free online as well. Now, and I think we will end up carrying this in the next lecture, which is fine. I plan to do that to an extent. The best place to start, in my view, there's a lot of disparate aspects to Hoppe's thought. I mean, we could talk for 10 minutes each on a lot of concrete areas, but to link them all together, what I plan to do is cover first his fundamental concepts. These will be familiar to a lot of you already because a lot of them are familiar or implicit or used already by Rothbard, Libertarians, and Austrians, and Mises. But Hans is very careful about picking out the fundamental ones, crisply and carefully defining them, and then actually using them and integrating them into his further reasoning as he builds on them. As I mentioned earlier, some Austrians just kind of touch on praxeology. They don't really sort of swim in it as I see it. This is an example of Hoppe developing these things for a purpose. He had this sort of German, precise, machine gun-like precision in his writing. Sometimes the sentences are a little long, but if you follow them, they just make perfect sense. He actually told me personally, when I saw him last time, that when he started writing in English, it actually improved his writing because it forced him to be more clear, to be clearer, because the English language is not as it's not the same as the German language in the way it lends itself to long, strung out but logical